I'd like to call to order the Board of Education special meeting for April 20th, 2016. We expect Mark Patton and Eileen Lou McCormick. Present at the moment is Mrs. Gerber, myself, Philip Dwyer, Mr. Calabrese, Mrs. Maxon Kennelly, and Mr. Llewellyn. We do have two members who were not able to make it for business reasons, and so we don't expect either Ms. Carnell or Ms. Pitko. So, if I could ask you to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. This is a special meeting, and by our bylaws, special meetings have the pledge, the business item, and adjournment. We don't have public comment at special meetings by our bylaws, and so that's why you don't see it on the agenda. Certainly any member here who has a viewpoint on this subject, the budget is in the hands of the RTM at the moment, and so you ought to email RTM members with whatever viewpoints you'd want to express. And of course RTM members who are in the crowd can express that themselves at their meeting. I thought I would take a couple of minutes just to kind of say here's where we are since the budget was presented, left this table and approved at this table. Currently the budget is in the hands of the RTM as the final body to vote on it. The Board of Selectmen and Board of Finance have already taken their actions on it. At the moment there is a $455,000 reduction based on an assumption that we may not need additional teachers for additional elementary school students. There's $1,530,000 reduced from the health insurance line based on what was improved claims experience, and therefore a different set of assumptions that were made by the Board of Finance that were not available to us because they had more months of experience, more current experience. The governor's original budget included a reduction of excess cost sharing, which is ECS, not to be confused with the excess cost grant, not to be confused with the current excess cost sharing, educational cost sharing grant that is the subject of the second governor's budget. And therefore, that $8 million cut statewide resulted in about $250,000 cut from the Fairfield budget, and the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Finance took that into consideration when they were making their decision. So that cut is covered, if you will. Thus, the net change, we had put in $165,393,000 in dollars, and we are now at $163,658 in dollars. So that's where the budget is at the moment. The board members received an email from the RTM moderator saying, in light of the discussions that are happening up at Hartford about how to solve the $930 million problem for next year, could the Board of Ed meet, and then could I come to their April 25th meeting? And so that's why tonight's meeting is being held. The $930 million projected shortfall, and it is a projected shortfall, the legislature approached it through the Appropriations Committee, essentially saying, let's try and find about half of the savings and then wait for tax day to arrive and see what the real projected revenue loss is. The governor did not support that approach and submitted his revised budget proposal that essentially took the educational cost sharing and reduced it for towns that had been covered under the hold harmless agreement. And he went from a 2% number down to 0%, and so 28 towns, largely in Fairfield and Litchfield County, lost 100% of their funding, which for us is $3,590,000. The loss of the special ed funding is still in his revised budget, so that $250,000 is already lost. The debate on that budget will carry on, as those of you who have watched the state budget debate know that somewhere around 5 minutes of midnight on the last day of the session, they finally wrangle a budget together. And so there may be headlines from now until then, but it all becomes headlines until the state passes their budget. Over the last week, there have been various thoughts as to how to solve this problem. One is take a guess at what the magnitude of the cut will eventually be, and then try and find savings to match that assumed cut. And that sounds reasonable. If you are advocating for Plan A, you generally aren't successful if you immediately put Plan B on the table. And so my viewpoint is and the board may have different viewpoints, is that if we're going to have the strongest argument for our delegation up at the state is to not say, hey, we've already covered the deficit, you don't have to worry about Fairfield. The other one is to vote on the budget as it exists today, and then knowing that the town and the board have always faced budget issues after the budget was passed, and therefore we're one town, we'll solve the issue, whatever it is, once we know what the fact is. A third is to postpone the RTM budget vote so that we can then deal with this as a fact and not as a projection. Whether the town charter supports that and whether the RTM supports that is not in our control, but that has been talked about. We have, as a Board of Ed, and this is kind of what I would intend to say on Monday, we have always been supportive of the one town idea. Some of us have used that phrase during campaigns that we're one town. We may be two different budgets, but we're one town. And there have been plenty of examples over the last several years where when the town had a shortfall and they asked the Board of Ed for help in that respect, we stepped up and did it. When the town got a better purchasing agreement for electricity, which produced about a $350,000 savings, we could have spent that money, but we agreed to say, no, we're not going to spend it, and we'll turn that back to the town at the end of the year. When we had that $700,000 savings from that one-time boost to the retirees, teacher retirees, we could have spent that, but we agreed that that money was better used to bolster the medical retention fund. On the town side, when we had the special education issue a couple of 3 years ago, where we had higher expenses for outplacements, Dr. Title and his staff found about 3/4 of that money to be saved, but we went to the Board of Finance and Board of Selectmen and said, could you cover up to $500,000 in the event we can't find any more money? I was proud of both bodies because unanimously they said, we've got your back. And then Dr. Title and his staff continued to work and found the extra money necessary, and we never had to go to the town and ask for that money. But it's another example of how the Board of Ed and the town have generally worked together. We have, as a board, always stood behind and advocated for this is the budget that we have presented, which meets the needs of students as we see it, and then we wait for all final decisions to be made, and then in May, when we know what the final decisions are, and then we do the budget adjustments necessary. And I'm presuming that that is the same approach that we'll take this year, because to make decisions on a projection and who wants to guess what the projection is. I have no doubt that there will be some cut, and the debate will continue. And so how to exactly solve that is something that I think the board will be challenged to work with the town on. And I think it would, at least I have represented to the town leadership at the moment, that individual members of the board, collectively and individually, will stand behind their historical past of saying, we are part of the solution, and we'll work to find some fair and equitable way to solve it once we know what the actual number is. That's where the last week of conversation has gone from kind of beginning to end, and now I turn it over to board members if they have a comment that they wish to make as to budget process, so that I might represent those views when I get to the meeting on Monday. Mrs. Maxon Kennelly.
I'll just start with a question. You're presenting those three options. Obviously, option 3 is tremendously appealing. What is the timeline on finding out an answer to that? I'm not optimistic about it. And option 3 being that idea of postponing the RTM budget vote. I've kind of assumed that that couldn't happen as much as obviously that would be a lot more practical, dealing with real numbers. What is the timeline on finding out if that's even viable?
One, I would say that's a legal question, and so therefore I'm sure there are various opinions on that, but clearly if the RTM wanted to do it, they could do it at whatever meeting they wanted to do it. Mr. Tetro, our first selectman, is here. For those of you who have not read the town charter, members of the Board of Selectmen are considered ex officio members of all boards and commissions, and so therefore if the ex officio member wishes to comment on that question, feel free to. And
well, how about John and I? Why don't we move down and get that one?
yeah, well, why don't you join us at the table and stay there in case you have other thoughts that you want to share with us. And I need not remind you to state your name for the TV audience.
Yes. Should I spell it also? Mr. Chair, thank you very much. Mike Tetro, First Selectman, just to cover that base. That question did come up. I've asked the town attorney. We've checked into both town charter and state statute. The town attorney has confirmed that we can delay the vote by the RTM. That's something that actually is common or not unfrequent in other communities, especially the ones that have town meetings where the entire community has to come together and vote. Cinda Buchter, our tax collector, was chair of the statewide Tax Collectors Association, and also commented she knew of towns that went well into the year, sometimes without a vote. We're not expecting to do that. There will be a written opinion from the town attorney on Monday night just to confirm that.
Does that answer your question? Other comments or questions by board members? Mrs. Gerber.
Yeah, well, I guess just to follow up on that, through the chair to Mr. Tetro, is there some date by which the RTM would have to meet? I mean, just in terms of, I know the mill rate has to be set at some point, the tax bills need to go out July 1st, so I'm assuming. So just backing it up, is there some date that would be the absolute latest? Or, I mean, just trying to get a sense of the timeline.
The simple answer is no. There literally are an example of a town that went an entire year without doing that. There are state statute guidelines in terms of what you could spend, how you do it. There's some logistical issues that I've asked the Chief Fiscal Officer, Bob Mayer, to look into in terms of two perspectives. One, narrowing down the steps, so based on whenever we know, how soon can we get out a tax bill, so we know what that step is. And then second, if it were delayed past July 1st, what are the steps? How do we fund the town budget that we're allowed to spend? We can spend up to last year's amount without an approved budget for this year. So there's some logistical speed bumps in doing that. That's not the preferred method, but it is possible to be done.
And just, I outlined the three options that have been discussed through various people. That doesn't mean those are the only options, but those have been the three most common options that have been commented on. I was at the Sherman PTA meeting this morning, and our state senator commented about a similar discussion is happening at the state level. Should we take some action, adjourn, and then call the General Assembly back into session again? So I think everybody is trying to figure out what are the options. both at the state level and the local level. Other comments or questions from board members? Mr. Patton?
Thank you all for coming out on such short notice. But I guess what's frustrating to me is that throughout this whole process, even before the state or the governor announced his proposals in terms of the potential cuts, is that, you know, we're facing, you know, between the health insurance experience and now this new situation that's come up, you know, we thought we kind of had it in the bag this year, where we saved all this money on a new health insurance plan, and we were able to add all these programs back in and enhance the education program in this town greatly, thanks to Dr. Title and his staff. And sadly, what would disappoint me is no matter what happens, obviously we're anticipating some kind of cut from the state. We're not sure where the health insurance thing is going to go. We don't have those reports back yet for the next month of experience. And you know, I just hate to see, you know, all these great things that we, you know, worked so hard to kind of put back in or to enhance, you know, to go bye-bye. So, you know, we'll do our best if that time comes, you know, in a couple of weeks. That if we have to adjust, then, you know, we'll do what we have to. And as the chair said, we'll work with the town, and we'll do what we can.
Other comments or questions from board members? I've asked for confirmation on one question, so I'm waiting for an answer. Researching it. The PowerPoint that is presented to the Board of Education gets updated with whatever new information is available when it's being presented to the Board of Selectmen and Board of Finance, and then it gets updated again when it's presented to the RTM, just so that the RTM in each body has the most recent information. And so when we presented, I'm dragging out this description, when we presented the RTM with the PowerPoint presentation, there were two new slides that were added to bring the RTM up to date with the decisions by the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Finance, which I outlined briefly, but also included a page that included the risks associated with those decisions, because there's no free lunch, and so you can make a different assumption about whether we'll need 1 or 7 additional sections in elementary school. The budget now is based on 0, and therefore there's a risk there. The health insurance has 4 more months of claims experience that have not yet been reported, so if it goes north, we're in good shape. If it goes south, we're not. So there's a risk involved with that. The state funding is certainly a risk. And so for those who may have an interest, that last PowerPoint is posted on the Board of Ed website. And so if you want to look at it, it's essentially the same, but go to the last 2 pages if you want the details of the exact changes that were made and the risks associated with those changes. Any other final comments? If not, any final comments? Mr. Tetro, do you want to make any final comments? You don't have to. I just make sure that you feel welcome to.
Nope, thank you. I think that the idea that as we look at this, as much as there are 2 revenue streams that have been discussed at the moment. One is the ECS, the other is the sales tax sharing. So overall, that's a $4.5 million number in the governor's proposal. That, by all accounts, that proposal will not pass at the state level. So part of the weight and part of the new information we're looking for is, if that doesn't pass, what does? What are the numbers, and what are the other partial cops? We only get about $9 million and change from the state. So at 4.5, that's about 50% of the state aid. The only silver lining in that is hopefully that any adjustments will not be any more than that, and should hopefully be less than that. So we're waiting, and I know that Dr. Title and I and Chairman Dwyer and I have been in frequent communication. I'd like to tell you there's lots of news going on in those calls. It's more confirming that we haven't heard anything yet, unfortunately. So we are waiting for the state to get back to us with that.
And I have talked to 3 of the 4 members of the state delegation. They are committed to being our advocates up in Hartford as well. As with our body and with the Board of Finance and Board of Selectmen and up in Hartford, I'm sure there are diverse opinions as to what is the best solution. And I'm sure that those opinions will be expressed, and eventually, because we are one town, this town will find a solution to it, and hopefully with no damage to our education system or the town amenities. If I see,
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
I have a motion to adjourn. Do I have a second? Mrs. Gerber, all in favor, please raise your hand. I can't, yeah, I'm sorry, yes, it's unanimous. Thank you very much. I couldn't see your hand behind Mark.